Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tenochtitlan. Today, I will be talking about Tenochtitlan, though I will primarily focus on this great city towards the end of the lecture. And I'm going to be talking about Tenochtitlan within the larger context of Mesoamerica, which is a broad cultural region. If you want to look at the PowerPoint, I have a couple maps showing you where that is. It is not, Mesoamerica is not a political designation. It's a cultural designation that anthropologists and historians have have defined based on some similarities, on some long similarities of images and of practices. And we will be talking about some of those things. So today is a kind of concrete look at the complexity and diversity of indigenous cultures in this particular region, Mesoamerica, and focusing on also the city-state of Tenochtitlan and other major cities and cultures that came before Tenochtitlan and that left important legacies on Tenochtitlan, which was what the Spaniards encountered, one of the places that the Spaniards encountered. And then in the next lecture, I will be doing the same thing for Cusco, centering on the city-state of Cusco within the larger cultural region of the Andes. Doing it this way is not the only way that one could give a quick overview of the indigenous Americas, of the Americas prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. But my goal in doing it this way is after the kind of overview discussion of major patterns in indigenous cultures and histories that I gave you in class, and then the discussion of talking in general, again, with a little bit more detail about these regions. Now, my point is to basically take you on a kind of whirlwind tour of some concrete histories and examples of a vast number of cultures in this region. And then I will do a little bit less detailed, but also whirlwind tour of the Andes in order to purposefully overwhelm you with the diversity and complexity of these places. So you are invited to sit back and enjoy the ride. I would like for you to try to notice patterns. So think about things that we spoke about. Think about the impact of internal isolation in terms of the geographical region and the impact that that had on political development and on worldview, on cosmology, on understanding of humans, the role of humans in the universe. Think about the five directions, including the fifth one, which is the sacred center. Think about the humans' responsibility to tend opposing forces of the universe, rain and earth, the sun and the moon, etc., the sky and the earth, etc. And think about the division of the world into chaos and order and other opposing forces. So notice those kinds of patterns and notice other patterns, which I will point out to a certain extent. But the reason why I want to kind of overwhelm you with detail now a little bit is, well, first of all, because it's impossible to really do anything else if I want to cover this enormous of a history, but primarily to combat the colonial flattening of these histories. So to combat what you will encounter as you study colonial history and as you encounter the colonial category of Indio or Indian. So the Spaniards, encountered these massive empires and small states and smaller communities and encountered the incredible cultural and linguistic diversity and vast geographical areas and were overwhelmed and recognized initially that they were dealing with distinct people, that they were dealing with incredibly complex political systems. But eventually, through a kind of administrative fiction, in an effort to turn all of these people into subjects of the crown, into to fit them into a colonial hierarchy that was developing, at least in name. And by saying at least in name, I do not mean that it did not have material impact. It did, but it never looked the way that the administrative fantasy intended it to or hoped it would. But increasingly, Spaniards began to refer to, and at least in the documents that we have and the things that we've built our histories out of, refer to all of these people as Indians. And you'll still see designations. You'll still see people talking about different language groups and different cultures and histories for sure. But increasingly, the colonial category of Indian comes to kind of flatten and erase, especially in retrospect, especially in our own histories built from these documents, erase this kind of diversity and complexity. So I want to say before I even begin that Indigenous people throughout the colonial period, throughout, all the way up until 1821, until the early 19th century, did not think of themselves as Indians in any meaningful sense in terms of culture or language or history. They quickly came to understand that they, in a legal sense, inhabited this colonial category of Indio. And people actually will talk about these things as we go on, but people didn't always stay in those colonial categories. They found ways of moving around and not always correctly being identified with that category. But they did understand that that was a meaningful legal category, but no one ever thought of themselves as Indian in the sense that you might think of yourself as French or Spanish or German or anything like that. People understood themselves to be from the nations that they were from. They spoke the language that they spoke. They were from increasingly Indian towns, and those towns also had a kind of political designation. And Indigenous people who lived in these towns understood that there was a particular kind of colonial apparatus that was similar in other Indian towns, and that there was a particular colonial apparatus that involved court structures, et cetera, and ways of interfacing with the colonial administration and the colonial government and the church enormously. That was extremely important in colonial society for Indigenous people. We'll talk about all these things. And even the king, they even came to understand themselves in relationship to Spain. And so as this kind of colonial identity developed in a legal sense, it still never erased the awareness of, who they were culturally, who their histories were, and who local authority figures were, et cetera. So the flattening of people into Indian who spoke, some kind of similar language or had, the same origin story or should have owed each other political allegiance or anything like that, it was a fiction. And so these lectures here, these detailed lectures, are really primarily intended to give you, in a concrete sense, an image that combats that flattening. So if you'd like to look at the map that I have on the PowerPoint, I have a couple of maps that show you the region that we're talking about. That is Mesoamerica. It is a cultural region, not a political region. It's defined by particular shared and long-standing cultural practices and images and things that show up over and over again. We'll talk about some of that. And if you want to look up other maps as I go along too, you might be interested. But Tenochtitlan was the great city of the people who have become known, who have come to be known as the Aztecs. And as I've mentioned before, there was really no such thing as Aztecs as people. The Aztec Empire was the name for a triple alliance, which was a political entity of three different city-states. And each of those three different city-states were inhabited by a different nation or a different ethnic group, all of whom spoke Nahuatl, but were distinct peoples. And the Triple Alliance was a political alliance in which Tenochtitlan was the most powerful. Tenochtitlan was the leader of the Triple Alliance, and the people who lived in Tenochtitlan, and so therefore were also the leaders of the Triple Alliance, were the Mexica, Mexica. And from Mexica came Mexico. And so during the colonial period, Tenochtitlan came to be known as Mexico City. And Spaniards did talk about the Mexican nation. And when they were talking about the Mexican nation, they were talking about the Mexica. And when we talk about the Aztec Empire being conquered, we are talking about Tenochtitlan falling in a military way, and the leaders of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica, being conquered by the Spaniards. So that's Tenochtitlan was the most powerful city in Mesoamerica at the time of the arrival of the Spaniards. And it had enormous significance, not only just political significance, but also what we might call religious significance, cosmological significance. And this was true not only for Tenochtitlan, but for other great Mesoamerican cities that came before it. So I'm going to come back to Tenochtitlan at the end of the lecture, but I'm going to first introduce you to some of its most significant predecessors in terms of the legacies that they left, both cultures and city-states. So Tenochtitlan had only been a powerful center of political and cultural and religious power for about 100 years by the time the Spaniards arrived. Before its rise to power, there'd been a number of other great states in the regions whose legacies in terms of political practices, cosmology, and ways of envisioning humans' relationships with each other and humans' relationships to nature and to what we might call the divine were also very significant to the people who lived in the time of the arrival of the Europeans. So by 1500 BC, and if you want to, you have your timeline, by 1500 BC, settled agriculture was being practiced in Mesoamerica. And with this began the development of small communities and small states. And when I say small states, I'm thinking about the size of a county, like a size of Franklin County here in Ohio. These small states were the most common social and political entity in Mesoamerica and actually throughout Latin America. But from about 1200 BC on, also the rise and fall of vast states, big states that sometimes developed into real kind of empires, was also a consistent fact in Mesoamerica. But the thing about those large states is that they rose and fell. They didn't last as long as the small states did, which tended to become a part of the large states and also outlast them. So these large states developed, sometimes incorporating the smaller states, or sometimes relating to them as autonomous but subordinate entities, that owed tribute or had different kinds of military relationships with them. And when these large states fell, they tended to leave massive architecture. They tended to leave the things that we still see today. So even though the small states were actually much more consistent and strong and durable, it's the large states that left us the kinds of visible imprint that lasted. So when they fell in political power, they often left behind massive temples or ball courts and other religious and political structures. And these structures in their time often became important ceremonial sites to future large states. And the large states inhabited and incorporated the histories of these large states. These large states also elaborated histories of the way the universe, or cosmological stories and origin stories, elaborate histories of particular deities or divine energies or representations of divine and natural forces or energy. Sometimes in complex systems of writing, other times in carvings and in oral traditions. A word on what I mean by writing. There was no alphabetic writing in pre-colonial Latin America, but there was really complex systems of representation that some scholars say we should think of as painting. Some think that they are kind of a combination of alphabetic-like glyphs and also pictograph kind of images. And so, many of these complex systems of writing had images that represented like syllables, that represented a collection of sounds. So in many ways, they were a lot like alphabetic language, but they weren't related to a single letter, but they were related to a sound. So you would put two or three of these glyphs together to make up a word, and the images didn't look like a concept. But they represented syllables. But often those same systems of writing also included images that did represent an entire concept or was meant to depict a scene or a relationship or something like that. And so there was a really complex kind of interplay between this kind of phonetic, sound-oriented writing and then these artistic representations that were, set images that meant something bigger than a syllabus. So a syllabus than a syllable. And these systems of writing were usually in intimate relationship with performance or oral history, but oral presentation. And there were experts, there were elite knowledge producers and knowledge guarders who were the ones who interpreted these writings and performed them or read them or interacted with them in public settings. And the meaning of them was not always fixed. This also had to do with the kinds of ways that we've been talking about in class about the relationship between the past and the present being a cyclical one. So all of these things are things I just want to mention when I quickly use the word writing. There were also many places that didn't have writing, and this was in fact or didn't have writing on paper, didn't have writing that was images. There were other kinds of storytelling practices in the Andes, for instance, that had to do with knots and ropes, and there are many other things like that. But so here in Mesoamerica, these large states were the ones that often left behind both the histories and stories in architecture and in things that we can see built into the natural environment, but also systems of writing and stories and histories and carvings and oral traditions and things like that. So these histories left in all these ways became important memories and legacies that, once again, future cultures drew upon and built upon. And all of this long genealogy and all of this long history is what comes to shape this large cultural area and define the large cultural area that we call Mesoamerica. I'm going to pause for a moment to get rid of that noise. Okay, I may not be able to stop some of that noise from coming through. I'm working on someone else's computer because my computer is having trouble. So the earliest of these great states, the big states, were the Olmecs. And now, if you like, I have a map that shows the area of Olmec influence and the area of sort of its peak power and then its area of influence. It's enormous. The Olmecs, we know that they had an influence on this large area because we see the things that they produced in these large areas. The Olmecs were first visible about 1400 BC, but they flourished most prominently from about 1200 BC to 400 BC, which is a long time. And then they disappeared sometime around 300 BC. They were located in swamps and grasslands of the Mexican Gulf Coast, especially in what is now western Tabasco and southern Veracruz. And if you like, you can look for some other, you can pause the video and look for some other images besides the one that I shared about the region that was the Olmec cultural area. We know very little about their about them really at all. We know very little about their religious practices. We know very little about their cultural practices, their social organization, but they left behind these statues of these gigantic heads, these enormous heads. And I have some images of those heads on the PowerPoint if you want to look. You can also just do a quick Google Olmec head, giant Olmec head, and you'll see them. They're all over the place. We do know that something about the way that they lived, or at least the way that their communities were structured because of architectural evidence and archaeological evidence. They were structured into many villages that surrounded large ceremonial and economic centers. So much like the Mexica of the later period, they seemed to have these the primary orientation or the primary social organization were these kind of small villages, but they all surrounded this big ceremonial center that was the seat of power and the seat of religious, political and religious power. Also, like the Mexica, they seem to have had ball courts where they played some kind of sacred ball game. I'll talk more about that later, and seem to practice some form of sacrificial bloodletting. And I want to remind you again that sacrifice is not necessarily the taking of human life, but of some kind of letting of blood that was envisioned in some way as a sacrifice, as a necessary way of tending to natural sacred forces. The jaguar was an important divine figure for the Olmecs. And this is one of the reoccurring images and figures with significant cosmological meaning that will repeat itself all throughout the long history of Mesoamerica. So the jaguar was important like an important divine figure or some kind of an important cosmological figure for the Olmecs. And among many other things, we think it represented the divine and natural forces of rain and fertility. Some scholars think that the huge heads were actually related to a jaguar rain god. So there's reasons why they think that, but there's still a lot of exact imagining to a certain degree. But the jaguar did remain a centrally important way that Mesoamericans envisioned divinity. Even 1,300 years later, the Mexica priests would wear jaguar skins and invoke the power of the divine jaguar in relation explicitly to divine forces of rain. So from long ago, we keep repeating in repeated ways over and over again, we see evidence of an association between the jaguar and rain, envisioned as an important what we might call divine energy, a sacred natural force. The Olmecs were also the first to depict Quetzalcoatl in their carvings. Quetzalcoatl is spelled Quetzalcoatl, and it's a Nahuatl word. So the Olmecs probably didn't call Quetzalcoatl, but there was this image in their carvings, and I have an image here. I have an image of an Olmec ball player, a couple of different images of jaguar carvings, a representation of a kind of jaguar human, and then in the 9th slide, I have images of the Olmec images of Quetzalcoatl. So Quetzalcoatl, again, we don't know what all the different cultures actually called this image, but Quetzalcoatl was a remarkably consistent representation that was a plumed serpent, some kind of divine, sacred, natural representation of divine forces or sacred forces, natural forces, etc. Remember, we have to think about them differently than we think about divine as separate from nature. That wasn't the way it seems to have been understood. But the image was that of a feathered serpent. And sometimes the feathered serpent looked more human, and sometimes it really looked more like a giant serpent with feathers. But this image of a feathered serpent is found throughout Mesoamerica from 1200 BC all the way to the time of the Spaniards. So, like I said, the Olmecs probably didn't call this figure Quetzalcoatl, but the image was really the same image that we find in different, slightly different versions throughout Mesoamerica for that entire time, from 1200 BC all the way until 1492 AD. So Quetzalcoatl, the name that we know it as, because that's what the Spaniards encountered. That's the name that the people that the Spaniards encountered gave to this plumed serpent. It comes from the Nahuatl word for quetzal, which is a precious green feather that grows from a particular bird that's on a particular bird, and coatl, which means serpent. So it's a feathered serpent. So Quetzalcoatl simply means feathered serpent. Scholars have written many, many, many books, whole libraries about Quetzalcoatl, and there are many interpretations of the stories that are left by the many cultures that revered this figure. But it is clear that this figure was a central and deeply revered figure. But there are a few commonalities that stretch across time and show up over and over again in these different stories. Among them are this: the bird represented the sky, seems to have represented the sky, which was associated with rain and fertility, and also the ordering of the cosmos. The serpent represented the earth, which was a chaotic and creative force. It was both destructive and regenerative. So Quetzalcoatl is a figure that represents the uniting not only of the sky and the earth and of rain and fertility, as well as the generative and regenerative properties of the earth, but it also united the ordering of the universe, which was represented by the sky and by rain, and to a certain degree, fertility as a characteristic of the sky and rain, and the chaos of the earth, which was thought of as a place where things went to die and things also were reborn. And so a kind of chaos of the earth incorporated, death and birth, regenerative, destructive, a kind of moving. And the sky represented the ordering of the universe, some sort of consistent sense of replenishment, of rain, and of the power of fertility, which is envisioned a little bit differently than just the generative properties of the earth. So we could think about that for a long time, but basically it does seem that Quetzalcoatl was a very important figure, because he, for lack of a better word, maybe we could say she, it was usually talked about as a male figure, but this figure represented that union, represented the union of the sky and the earth, and also, rain and the earth. So in some ways, both the sky and the earth were related to what we might think of as fertility, but the sky represented a kind of cosmic birth, a cosmic genesis. Rain was a gift from the sky, and the sky had the potential to give form and order to a chaotic, generative earth. And Quetzalcoatl, unified these forces. The center of the earth was envisioned as the place where things went to die and degenerate, but also where things were born again. And it was only through the union of the sky and the earth that such a cycle of birth and death and regeneration was possible. And Quetzalcoatl represented this union. And so in an important way, also Quetzalcoatl represented the destruction and recreation or new creation of the eras, of the worlds. Mesoamerican cultures understood the universe to have been organized in cycles of time, eras that were sometimes called Earth, sometimes called suns, but they were eras of time in which the universe was created, developed, and then was destroyed, and then was created again. So it was understood that there was this constant cycle of, there were long cycles, but that people knew that they were living only in a current era, and that there would be future eras, that the world that they were living in would be completely destroyed, and something else would take its place and it would start over again, and that they were only the most recent of these cyclical eras of creation and destruction. And the previous eras were often different. Animals behave differently. The relationship between humans and the land was different. So it wasn't like it was just being recreated as the same thing. There were eras, different kinds of laws of nature, different kinds of ways of, um, things worked differently in these different eras. But Quetzalcoatl seemed to follow all of these eras. And so part of the energy of Quetzalcoatl was that he represented this cycle of birth and regeneration, birth and death and regeneration, birth and death and regeneration. Okay, so those are some patterns about Quetzalcoatl. So an extremely important ceremonial center was built around 200 BC in the Valley of Mexico, near current-day Mexico City, and it was called Teotihuacan. I mentioned this the other day. So we're now jumping. So we're talking about the Olmecs and their period, their era of influence. Now we're moving to the Valley of Mexico, where Tenochtitlan is. And so about 200 BC, in the Valley of Mexico, near the current day of Mexico City, near what became Tenochtitlan, was Teotihuacan, Teotihuacan. And I have, after a few images of Quetzalcoatl on the PowerPoint, there is an image of Teotihuacan. And also a number of images of Quetzalcoatl in Teotihuacan. So, very different place or different region, long ways away from the Olmec influence. And you see Quetzalcoatl showing up. So we know almost nothing about the people who built Teotihuacan, except that they seemed to be a dominant cultural and religious force from about 200 BC to 650 AD. Teotihuacan had enormous periods and had images of the rain god Tlaloc, and it's possible that the rain god Tlaloc had a relationship with those large Olmec heads long ago, but Tlaloc was a rain god that showed up, and at least for sure it was there in Teotihuacan, and then later appeared in Oaxaca and was also later adopted by the Mexica people. But Quetzalcoatl was central also in the carvings of Teotihuacan, and I have a number of images of Quetzalcoatl on the PowerPoint if you'd like to pause the video and take a look. The culture that built Teotihuacan disappeared about 650 AD, but the huge pyramids and ceremonial center continued to be used by other cultures. An important group called the Toltecs, Toltecs, and later the Mexica, who inhabited Teotihuacan, who inhabited Tenochtitlan. My apology, I'm going to say that again so you don't get confused. An important group called the Toltecs, and then also later Mexica who lived in Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City, both called Teotihuacan, the city that was not that far from Mexico City, the place of the gods. And they treated it as a sacred pilgrimage site and a place of very special high ceremonies. So by the time the Toltecs came, which I will return to the Toltecs a little bit later because they came later, but I am now, where I am in the timeline is to talk about Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan existed from 200 BC to 650 AD, and then they disappeared. The Toltecs didn't come for much later. And so I'm going to talk about them a little later. And now I'm going to talk about the Mayan, who are chronologically significant before the Toltecs. But the reason why I bring up the Toltecs now is simply to say that Teotihuacan seemed to be a very important culture in which Quetzalcoatl was really super important, but they disappeared in 650 AD. And by the time other great cultures, including the Toltecs and the Mexica, came along, Teotihuacan was abandoned. It was just this city with all of these carvings and all of these carvings of Tlaloc and all these carvings of Quetzalcoatl and all these giant pyramids. And so the people that came later treated it as a city of the gods, as an abandoned place where divinity probably lived before. And they treated it as a pilgrimage site, and they had major ceremonial centers. So that's what we know about Teotihuacan, but it becomes important for later cultures. But now I want to talk about the Mayan. So perhaps the well-known great state in Mesoamerica, the most well-known great state in Mesoamerica is the Mayan Empire. So the Maya had an enormous influence on the religion and culture and political structure, really, culture of the region, and was the longest lasting of any of the great states or cultures. So and I have some images of Mayan temples and Mayan ball courts and Mayan cities, a whole bunch of them on the PowerPoint if you want to pause and take a look at some of them. I also have an image of the Mayan calendar. So because of the ceremonial and cultural similarities with the Olmecs, and because the Olmecs slowly declined from about 400 to 300 BC, at the same time that the Maya were slowly developing, some scholars think that a gradual southern Olmec migration is actually what led to the emergence of the Mayan culture in the south. So it's possible that basically the Olmecs were the ancestors of the Mayans, basically. But so we see the Olmec civilization disappear, but they are also in decline gradually, just as the Mayan culture is developing. So it could be that the Olmecs were migrating south, and that this migration, perhaps infused communities that were already there with images and information and knowledge and things like that, and political practices, and that perhaps this is what led to that is part of, anyways, the rise of the Mayan culture. We don't really know why people left places. We don't know why the Olmecs left where they lived and why that gradual decline happened. We don't really know that for the later Mayans as either. But at any rate, the Mayan society and kind of high state ceremonial practices, etc., first emerged as a powerful force around 300 BC in Chiapas and the Yucatan in southern Mexico. So you can look at a map if you want to see exactly where the Yucatan Peninsula is and where Chiapas is in Mexico, modern day Mexico. That's where they first became visible as a powerful political and religious force, but they later flourished throughout an enormous area that included southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, western Honduras, and El Salvador. So the Mayans were in the south of Mexico and south throughout Central America. They developed ceremonial centers in the tropical forest, which consisted of enormous stone temple pyramids and platforms and observatories where they practiced astronomy, and there were great ball courts. And I have, as I said, images of some of those if you want to pause the video and look at those. Scholars talk about Mayan society as being divided into three general periods: the pre-classic, which is before 300 BC, the classic, which is from 300 BC to 900 AD, and the post-classic period, which is after 900 AD and stretches to the time of the European conquest. During the classic phase, some extremely important ceremonial centers of pyramids and platforms developed in Palenque in southern Mexico and in Tikal in modern-day Guatemala. And so if you want, you can look at, I have images of both of those places, Palenque and Tikal. The Mayans developed highly advanced studies of astronomy, in which they accurately predicted movements of heavenly bodies, eclipses, and other celestial events decades and centuries in advance. Their calendars and complex numbering systems, mathematical systems, and astronomical observations had deep cosmological or religious significance. Their view of the cosmos linked the earth and the heavens in a way that went beyond reverence for rain and sky. So, different than just the sort of relationship between the sky and the earth and fertility and regeneration, but which understood the earth as a part of a much greater universe. So they were the first that we know of, where you really see the earth as part of a universe, and cosmological religious devotion as incorporating all of the heavenly bodies, as incorporating this vast universe of which they understood the earth was only a small part. So this had significant, lasting significance in Mesoamerica, but it was never quite repeated to the same extent or vigor that it was with the Mayans. But their conception of time was deeply influential in Mesoamerican traditions. Time was understood, as I've mentioned before, as existing in sacred, repeating cycles of distinct ages or eras in which the world ended and then began again in a new era. And that was most clearly first articulated under the Maya, at least that we know of, at least that we see represented. The jaguar continued to be a presence for Maya and to be associated with the warrior rain god holding lightning and thunder. So in the Mayan cosmology, the rain god, this divinity, this representation of the divine force of rain was called Chak or Chaak, Chaak. The Mexica would later call this rain god Tlaloc. And they would point to the image of the rain god at Teotihuacan and understand it as Tlaloc. And the Toltecs probably understood it that way too. But the Mexica representation of Tlaloc bore similarities to the Mayan Chak as well. So there was influence between the Mayans and the later Mexica. And so some of these images, Tlaloc probably had its origin in the rain god of Teotihuacan and later the Toltecs, but also an influence from the rain god as envisioned, the warrior rain god as envisioned by the Maya, and which was called Chak, and which may have had its predecessor and may have had a relationship to the Olmec head. And all of them have some relationship to jaguars also, which is interesting. And Chak also looks like it has an elephant nose, which is a whole nother story, but because there weren't elephants there in the Americas, at least unless you're talking about prehistoric woolly mammoths. But at any rate, there's some really interesting things that people have talked about, like sort of popular theories and things like that about that. But at any rate, you can look at all these different. If you probably should pause the video, go look for images of Mayan Chak, Chaak, and then the Mexica Tlaloc, and you can see comparisons of these images. It might be fun to do. You can do it later too if you want. So Mexica priests wore jaguar skins, as I mentioned before, in service to Tlaloc, hearkening back to the Olmec and Mayan influences, as well as those of Teotihuacan and the Toltecs. And in some Mayan ceremonial centers that rose up at the end of the Classic period, Quetzalcoatl makes a resurgence. You don't really see Quetzalcoatl. You see Quetzalcoatl among the Olmecs, but then you don't see Quetzalcoatl as much in some of the earlier eras of the Mayans. But then in the Classic period, Quetzalcoatl becomes really important once again. Another culture Zoom, zoom, zoom. We're going all over for this fast-paced tour. Another culture for whom Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl were important was the Zapotec in Oaxaca. And if you want, pause the video, look for a map of Mexico to find out where Oaxaca is. Also, if you want, in the PowerPoint, I have images of the Mayan jaguar, the Mayan calendar, and then the Mayan jaguar, and then the Mayan chalk and Mexican Tlaloc, the Tlaloc from Mexica, side by side, so you can see some of the similarities. And then also of the Mayan representations of Quetzalcoatl, particularly in this particular place in Chichen Itza. And then I have an image of Monte Albon in Oaxaca, which was the great ceremonial and cultural center of the Zapotec, Zapotec. So the Zapotec rise up in Oaxaca. They have a great ceremonial and cultural center called Monte Alban, Monte, one word, Alban, second word. And so by 650 AD, Monte Alban was the dominant cultural and religious force in the region. In that region, like the other ceremonial centers and cities of Mesoamerica, it had huge pyramids, ball courts, rain god representations, as well as feathered serpent representations that were prevalent in the carvings of all of these places. And you can see images. I have a little bit of an out of order thing. Yeah, let me tell you about something. So if you're looking at the PowerPoint, you'll see an image of Mixcoatl, which is a cloud serpent, not Quetzalcoatl, which was the plumed, feathered serpent. So Mixcoatl is a different image, and I'll talk about him in a minute, but it shows up after Monte Albon in Oaxaca in my PowerPoint. So the influence of Monte Albon stretched into the Valley of Mexico, into the area of Teotihuacan until about 900 AD. So from Oaxaca all the way into central Mexico, where Tenochtitlan would rise up, but it was Teotihuacan, etc. So from the period between 1200 BC and 900 AD, all of these cultures I have mentioned left behind important religious and cultural legacies. And I want to now name some of these things as a pattern. So if you want to pause for a second, take a breath, look at some of the images if you want. I'm about to talk about some similarities for this whole long period of time between 1200 BC and 900 AD. These are the important legacies that they left behind, or some of them anyways. A deep study of heavenly bodies was a part of these legacies. Particular ways of understanding time and history was a part of these legacies. The symbolic and sacred meaning of numbers was a part of these legacies. A deep reverence for rain and its ordering and life-giving powers was also a part of that. A respect for the creative, destructive, and regenerative powers of the earth was also a common legacy and a part of what was left. And a belief in the need for balance between these powers, as symbolized by Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was a representation of the balance that needed to happen between these powers of order and chaos, between the sky and the earth, etc., between rain and the earth. So one thing I have not talked about yet really much is human sacrifice. And so what I want to say right off the bat is that there's so much controversy among scholars about how much human sacrifice was actually practiced, when it started, where it took place, and in some cases, even if it actually happened at all. It's sort of difficult to sort through all of the evidence and scholarly arguments about it because it's also a very loaded topic. But it does seem clear to me and to most of my colleagues that what is essentially true is that the notion that human beings had to intervene in order to keep the balance between the powerful forces of the universe was an important concept throughout Mesoamerica, and that in order to do this, human blood was needed. Human blood was the means by which human beings intervened in order to keep this balance in balance, keep this balance between the powerful voices, maintain the balances between these opposing forces. So, but blood sacrifice could be accomplished without the taking of human life, but the giving of blood was essential. And then it was thought that human blood was literally reborn into things like corn, new humans, and other life, that humans actually played an essential role in the holding on to the regenerative powers of the earth. And so the idea that also human beings died and were put into the earth, and also animals died and were decayed into the earth, and plants, etc. This was just a continuation of that, life was given to the earth, and blood and bodies, etc., became a part of the widespread regenerative powers of the earth. However, it seemed also important that not just in a natural cycle of life and death, but that humans needed to actually enact blood sacrifice, to give blood to the earth. But it was done in a ceremonial way. It wasn't like people went around and watered their garden with their blood. That's not what I'm saying. It was a ceremonial, sacred communication of this gift. So it's not like when you planted corn, you had to put blood in it. That's not what I mean. But the idea that humans sacrificed their blood did contribute to the alive, sacred, regenerative power of the earth in this cosmological way of understanding divinity as, or sacredness, sacred power as infused into and also emerging from the visible, physical, natural world. So to the extent that human sacrifice was practiced, it seems clear that it increased with both. So it also seems to me and most of my colleagues that there was some human sacrifice practice at least. And in some places practiced more extensively than others. And to the extent that human sacrifice was practiced, it seems clear that it increased with both the power and also the instability of these large states. So as these large states got bigger and bigger and also started to impose their power and also started to become unstable and had to exert more military kind of force in order to maintain their dominance in the cultural region, those moments where we can see that kind of political history happen seemed to correspond with an increase in human sacrifice. So, for instance, it seems that human sacrifice may not have been practiced at all, or at least not very much, by the Mayans, for instance, until the very end of the Classic period. One theory, and this is just a theory, but there's reasons to think it could be true, but one theory is that the Northern Toltec influence, who lived in the region of Teotihuacan after the people who built Teotihuacan, that it was the Northern Toltec influence that brought human sacrifice increasingly to the Mayans, that, there was communication and there was Southern migration from the Toltecs. And then also the Toltecs left this legacy for the Mexica to draw upon much later as they constructed their own society and remembered things and drew upon legacies and decided how to order their political dominance. So around 900 AD, in the beginning of the post-classic Mayan period, Toltecs came into the Valley of Mexico from southern Zacatecas. So again, if you want to, you can look at a map and see where Zacatecas is. The Toltecs come into the Valley of Mexico in 900 AD. And here's where Mixcoatl comes in, the cloud serpent, and that's Mixcoatle. Remember, Coatl is the Nahuatl word for serpent. So the story goes of the Toltecs' arrival. This is the kind of, mythical, historical that they told themselves and left as a legacy story about how the Toltecs came into the Valley of Mexico. And this story goes that they were led by Mixcoatl, the cloud serpent, who became a divine and mythical warrior. So it was kind of human and then became divine. And then over a short period of about 60 or 70 years after Mixcoatl led them into the Valley of Mexico, the Toltecs established military dominance in the Valley of Mexico and stretched their political and cultural and religious influence all the way south to the southern Mayan region, changing religious practice, changing architecture, language, writing, even changing the Mayan calendar. So you have the southern Olmecs, influencing the Mayans potentially. I mean, you have the Olmecs migrating south and influencing the Mayans. You have much later the Toltecs migrating south, influencing the Mayans. But you have this northern culture developing and drawing upon at least the memory of Teotihuacan. Okay, I know it's confusing. So if you want, you can pause and you can look at the timeline, or maybe even you want to get out a map and draw lines or things like that. But all of this is here also in written form for you. But the story goes that Mixcoatl's son, Topiltzin, Topiltzin, became a devotee of Quetzalcoatl, and it's because of him that the abandoned city of Teotihuacan became an important ceremonial site. So Mixcoatl leads the Toltecs into the Valley of Mexico. Mixcoatl's son becomes a devotee of Quetzalcoatl. These are divine and human figures, and these are mythical stories, and they have been passed down for a long time. So the story goes that Topiltzin, Mixcoatl's son, becomes a devotee of Quetzalcoatl, and encounters Quetzalcoatl and Teotihuacan, and the abandoned city of Teotihuacan becomes incorporated by the Toltecs as an important ceremonial site for them. So then around 980, the Toltec are powerful enough that they build their own ceremonial center called Tula, T-U-L-A, and I have images of Tula. I have Topiltzin, I have an image of Topiltzin as the devotee of Quetzalcoatl, and you can actually see bloodletting in that image, and that comes after the image of Mixcoatl. And then after that image of Topiltzin, there are some images of Tula, followed by also some images of the Toltec Quetzalcoatl. So the Toltecs build their own ceremonial center called Tula, which would also have mythical significance to the later Mexica. And they started developing their own images of Quetzalcoatl instead of just having a devotion to the images of Quetzalcoatl that existed in Teotihuacan. So competing religious factions developed in Tula, and wars between them, along with drought and famine, led to a weakening of the city. And then in 1165 AD, Tula was destroyed by new militaristic immigrants coming in from the north. The collapse of Tula allowed waves of these northern peoples to enter into the Valley of Mexico. Guess who was among these waves of northern militaristic people? The Mexica. The Mexica people were one of these groups, and they arrived on the scene at about 1250. So the Spaniards get to the Americas, and they first get there in the Caribbean in 1492. They don't come to Tenochtitlan until the 1500s. So 1520 is normally thought of as the conquering of the Aztec Empire. But so 1492, 1520, right? 1492 is when the Spaniards arrived. The Mexica just got to what was Mexico City 1250 AD, just a little a little bit more than 200 years prior. That's just when they first got there, and they weren't powerful at first, right? So they spent their first 100 years after their arrival in the Valley of Mexico battling everyone around them. Um, but their histories describe a spiritual vision in which the Valley of Mexico was a promised land for them. The Mexica said, and this we talked about this a little bit in class, that they came from a mythical birthplace far in the north called Aztlan, Aztlan, perhaps in what is now the southwestern United States or California. The Mexica also claimed that the ancestors of the Toltecs had also come from this place and that they were descended from the same people. So the Mexica come from the north. They start battling all the people that had previously been subjugated by the Toltecs, but the Toltecs had fallen, left a power vacuum. And the Mexica come with this vision that they're meant to arrive in a place called that they would discover, and I'm going to say something about that in a second. But they start battling everyone around them, but they also adopt the Toltecs and the legacy of the Toltec as not just their political vision, but as their real ancestors. They claimed that the ancestors of the Toltecs also came from Aslam. There's no evidence that the Toltecs necessarily talked about themselves that way, but the Mexica understood their histories as saying that the Toltecs had come from Aslan. And so therefore the Mexica were descended from the same people, that had led to the Toltecs and, this great political power that the Toltecs were, that had fallen by the time the Mexica got there. So the Mexica's story was that the ancestors of the Toltecs that they had common ancestors. They were descended from these same people who were in Aztlan, and that they were guided out of this place, wandering for many generations, talking about the Mexica now, wandering for many generations by a prophecy that said that they would someday find a promised land, and that in this land they would rise to power and they would become good stewards of the earth, the sun, and the rain, and that they would bring about order to this land. And they would know this place and know that it was their job to become this power, because when they saw it, they would see an eagle with a serpent in its mouth sitting on a cactus. And so that becomes the image on the Mexican flag, as many of you may know. But to me, now this is just me. This is not something that scholars have said is for sure true or anything. But to me, the similarity between the winged and feathered serpent and the image of the eagle with a serpent in its mouth is really striking, especially the serpent in its mouth sitting on a cactus. It's a symbol of parched earth in need of replenishing. That just really strikes me as having a connection to Quetzalcoatl. So it seems to me that this eagle and serpent was in some way a representation of Quetzalcoatl, and also the need for devotion to Tlaloc, or the rain god, and the need for human sacrifice or propitiation or tending to ease the thirst of the image. To ease the thirst of the earth. I have here show images. That's why I said that, to ease the thirst of the earth. And so if you want to, you can go to the PowerPoint and you can look at the Mexica eagle and snake. And you can see you can look at that, and you can look at other images online too. So the Mexica found this symbol, the eagle with the snake in its mouth sitting on a cactus, in the island city of Tenochtitlan, which was a place that was both protected by the surrounding lakes and also a place no one really wanted to settle. By 1350, they had made it their home. It was hard to live in this, island city in the middle of the lake because there was a lot of lake and there was a lot of it was kind there were patches of land. It seemed that there were patches of land, and it was hard to build very much on it. But by 1350, they started dredging the lake bottom to create more surface soil and developing trade routes and forming tribute agreements with local authorities of small settlements. And so they built this enormous, beautiful, by all accounts, sort of floating city of Tenochtitlan that was surrounded by a lake that had lake channels going through the city itself, and but also, was tended to and built up by dredging the lake bottom. They gradually rose to power, building an enormous, extraordinary city of temples as they did. So by about 1440, they were at the height of their cultural and political and religious power. And at that point, they had a kind of loose hold over much of central and southern Mexico, including the Mayan regions. So 1440, 1440, they're at the height of their power. 1492 is when the Spaniards arrive. So this empire has come to be known as the Aztec Empire, and it was the name that the Spaniards gave it. The Aztec Empire actually referred to what was called the Triple Alliance, but in Nahuatl language. The Triple Alliance was a military partnership between three cities: Tenochtitlan, where the Mexica lived, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. Tenochtitlan was dominant, and the Mexica were the people who ruled and inhabited Tenochtitlan. And if you want to, you can see a whole bunch of images that I have of the city and of the area, etc. You can also see an image of a codex of an indigenous history document painting that tells the story of the serpent and in the mouth of the eagle sitting on the cactus, and it's an interesting image there. So Tenochtitlan was not just a city that people lived in, and was not just a religious ceremonial site. The city itself was a representation of Mexica cosmology and religious beliefs. The concept of the five sacred directions was central to the layout of the city. Students of Native American traditions often refer to four directions. We talked about this a little bit in class, but there really was also a fifth direction, which was the sacred center that the other four directions surrounded. And the center was not simply considered just a place, it was also an actual direction, which makes sense in terms of thinking about the center of the earth and things like that. So the architecture of the city and the canals and the marketplaces and the temples all reflected this notion of the five directions. It also reflected a complete intertwining of imperial authority and human desire for communication with a kind of divine authority. The Mexica's religious vision seemed to have been, or cosmological vision, seemed to have been one of majesty, intensity, but also order. Tenochtitlan was built to represent a oneness of nature, divine forces and human order and participation in those divine natural forces. Time and space were inseparable as well. History was measured through the movement of great heavenly bodies, astronomy, and cycles of creation and disruption, understood as the different ages. Like the Maya, the Mexica believed that there had been previous ages or worlds. They referred to them as suns. They believed that they were in the age of the fifth sun and that its destruction was imminent. This becomes really significant in the ways that Mexica histories tell the story of the arrival of the Spaniards. And it may be impossible to know how soon they thought that age would end, that sun would end, prior to epidemic disease and prior to the military conquest of the temple, etc. Because those histories are retold and the past is reimagined to incorporate the events surrounding them. That was a way that time and history seemed to be understood, that the relationship between the past and the present seemed to be understood. So, but From what we can see, from what we have remaining, the Mexica seemed to believe that their city, Tenochtitlan, played an active and crucial role in these cycles of creation and destruction. And they talked about Tenochtitlan as sitting at the center, the navel of sacred space, at the center of that sacred center, that fifth direction. So at the kind of navel of sacred space. Tenochtitlan was an extremely urban place with monumental buildings and very well-ordered streets and canals and marketplaces. But all of this order was seen as intimately connected to the cosmic and natural order in the stars, etc., and all around surrounding them in nature. There was no sense of humans dominating nature as was expressed by Europeans and in European city planning at the time. On the contrary, there was a deep need for humans to participate in partnership with natural and divine forces to ensure the continuation of life. And the building of this city and the ceremonies that went on there were, in fact, considered a part of that human duty to balance the forces of the cosmos. They believed that the sun and the rain gods gave life to earth and that it was the duty of human populations to give back to the sun and the rain gods and to replenish the power of the earth. And blood was the gift that was needed. So blood was this sacred substance of life, and in spilling it, the earth and the sun were regenerated. Human life and blood and the life of all of the universe was intimately related in the ways that these stories were told. There was an eternal and daily struggle between the sun and the moon, between night and day. We've talked about this a little bit. And as a result of that struggle, the earth lost energy and needed blood to regenerate itself. So ceremonial wars were waged by all three of these major cities in the Triple Alliance against the subject peoples of the empire to gather subjects for either blood or for life sacrifices. By the time of the Spanish arrival, it seems that this practice had accelerated, and also that the power of the Triple Alliance, and particularly the Mexica and Tenochtitlan, was getting shakier and more tenuous. Whether the ceremonial wars, which were known as flowery wars, that's what the Mexica called them, were the cause of this shakiness, were the cause of the tenuous power, or whether it was the other way around, whether their power was declining and they were attempting to assert it more and more through the practice of the flowery wars. Hold on one second. I had this terrible feeling that nothing had been recorded. I don't think that's true. I hope it's not true. But at any rate, so, it's a matter of debate among scholars about whether or not the flowery wars caused the shakiness or whether the shakiness, led to the increase in the flowery wars, etc. But it does seem that scholars have argued that they've seen this pattern over and over again, that there was, there's a connection in Mesoamerican history in general between the end of these great states and periods of increasing instability, political instability, and an increase in human sacrifice. The three most prominent representations of energy or divinity or sacred forces, divine energies, etc., in the Mexica cosmology were Huitzilipochtli, which was the sun god. And I have an image of Huitzilipochtli, and that is a very long word, but it is spelled Huitzilopotchli. And Huitzilipochtli is the sun god. And I have some images, or one image of that. And then Tlaloc, which the rain god we've talked about, and of course Quetzalcoatl. So there you go. I would like to invite you now to pause the video or to stop the video and to take a look at some of these images again. Maybe look at your timeline, think about some of your notes from the earlier lectures, but mostly just to kind of jot down anything that you remember, anything that you remember from what I said that you find interesting. Think about patterns. Think about the relationship between some of the other bigger patterns we've talked about, and just take a moment to reflect and sort of write some notes about what you've heard. All right. Thank you for your attention.